Welcome to our virtual space, where thought leaders who, in a variety of ways, have committed themselves to improving our lives share their work, perspectives on current affairs, and what brought them to where they are today. My name is Rob Liu, and this is The Xchange. So, Dave, I just want to thank you for spending some time with us in the Exchange. As you know, the Exchange is a range of individuals engaged with science in a variety of ways that are sharing their stories, if you will, of how they came to science or a field that's affiliated with science or aligned with science, but also how the current COVID-19 pandemic has changed their work and in some ways has changed their outlook for what the future might hold for the field that they might be working with. So you, of course, are deeply engaged with biotechnology. You head research and development for Amgen. And so one question I have for you, though, before we launch into that specifically, is when we think about your journey, when we think about what brought you to where you are today, and perhaps more broadly, what brought you to science, can you think about a time in your life where there was a particular event that sort of turned you on to science and arguably set you on the path that sort of led you to where you are today?
Yeah, well, thanks, Rob. To me, it didn't come through family or what I would call externalities. I grew up in a little town in Ohio. No, I was the first one in my family to go to college, let alone think about a career in science. And when I was 14 years old, I read this little book, this big fat book called The Origin of Species by Mr. Charles Darwin. And that really fixed in my mind, even though I was very unsophisticated, didn't know much about the world, but it fixed in my mind that somehow I have to be a part of this. And that, coupled with then beginning to talk to teachers in high school, as so many of us, of course, will describe, but having a mentor at every step of the way is critical. And I had a high school teacher who took an interest in me and encouraged reading and discussion in science beyond the high school curriculum that existed in my public school in this little town. And that's really what I said. I would say were the first steps on the road.
Fantastic. So it's quite amazing to be inspired by Charles Darwin, right, in terms of engagement
And
with the life
humbling,
sciences.
and humbling.
Yes, yes. But so you right now are doing so much in biotechnology, in drug development, in pharmaceuticals. And I suspect that many of our viewers and listeners have some sense of what that really involves. But as we have discussed in previous conversations, we're both struck by the fact that when folks think about research and development in pharma, they actually don't realize all the different things that go into R&D. And so as someone that has, gone to medical school, has had a career in medicine, switched into pharma, sort of, etc., can you perhaps share an insight for our audience as to what R&D in a large pharma company like Amgen actually means?
Yeah, it's a great question. It sometimes is a bit of mystery to the outside world. There are things that we do that are very familiar to someone, say, in academia, and there are things that we do that are arts and sciences in and of themselves. And that really spans the gamut from basic research. So we have a research organization headed by a world-class scientist, member of the National Academy, longtime Caltech professor, where we're grappling with fundamental questions of biology. What are the drivers of disease? What are the molecular alterations? What are the genetics of certain diseases? But then all of that is done with applied science in mind. What we're doing is really applied science writ large. How do you take those insights and then translate them into a drug that ultimately can be effective in alleviating human suffering and in treating human disease. And so then, we are thinking about very fundamental biologic pathways and targets, and then we start thinking about molecules. Uh, how can we interdict a pathway, for example, that seems to be important in a given disease? Once we start talking about molecules, there's a whole science of how we screen for and develop candidate molecules, whether they are complex biologics, small molecules that are derived from medicinal chemistry, or increasingly some sort of hybrid or highly engineered molecules that are designed in a fit for purpose fashion. And we start playing with molecules, optimizing them, constantly referring back to the biology, but that's still only another step on the journey. And the next step is then going from a molecule to a medicine. And that's a big step. We have to eventually derive what we call a clinical candidate, a molecule that we think has the attributes that are required to be a successful medicine. And we then have to actually make that fit for human administration. And this is an area that is really a science in and of itself, something we call process development. How do you actually formulate a molecule? How do you deliver it? Is it going to be subcutaneous? Is it going to be intravenous? If it's a small molecule, is it going to be orally administered? If so, will the bioavailability be adequate? So a whole host of factors come to bear that involve in vitro and in vivo experiments. And eventually, we put all that together with preclinical safety
Mhm.
experiment. And that's another area, toxicology, that is a field unto itself. And we say, we have a package that tells us that this is a molecule that has promise in humans and it's appropriate to be administered to humans. And at that point, in the United States, you file what's called an IND, an investigational new drug application with the FDA, and you embark on clinical testing. So now you're maybe 30% of the way to actually getting a medicine. And of course, then there are the phases of drug development in the clinic. Phase one, which is typically dose finding and safety focused. Phase two, we continue safety exploration, but we want to actually understand what now is the potential efficacy or effectiveness of the drug. And then ultimately, larger phase three trials that tell us, okay, is this a medicine that's better than what currently exists, if anything exists? And then finally, there is the entire regulatory component, taking that entire package and putting it in an appropriate format for the FDA to review, and then, if you are lucky, achieving the market. So that's a sort of telescoped view. It involves hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of different types of roles for scientists and clinicians along the way.
Yeah, so you've certainly laid out what seems like and is such a long and complicated road. And I would say it's fair to say that starting with a large group of possible promising candidates, at probably each step along that road, you lose some, if not many, by the wayside. Am I correct?
Yeah, so there's a huge amount of attrition. And so you start, from the very early days of screening for, candidate molecules, with a very large funnel. And that funnel gets narrower and narrower as there is attrition of molecules, until you get to a clinical candidate. Once you go into the clinic, roughly 8 to 12% of molecules that enter human testing, phase one testing, will ultimately make it across the finish line and become an approved medicine. So there's still, attrition that occurs once one reaches the clinic, one of the things I point out to my team is that if we could just improve to the point where we were only failing 80% of the time, we would be the best ever
Right.
by a factor of two.
Yes,
And so that, you have to be willing to accept deferred gratification, and you have to be willing to accept a lot of failure along the way, to wait for those successes. But I can tell you that when the successes come, there's absolutely no feeling like it on earth to say, hey, I think this is going to be a real contribution to human health.
of course. Fantastic. So there's no question that COVID-19 has really presented all of humanity with a remarkable challenge. And given the fact that it is a disease, that it is an infectious disease, um, I'm sure that a company like Amgen and teams like yours are, of course, thinking about this and working on this to sort of a remarkable degree. But besides the fact that you're really engaged with, I think, a range of ways of thinking about COVID and are, I'm sure, working on things that will hopefully yield treatments perhaps in the future, if we look at what's happened with the pandemic broadly, is there ways in which the current crisis has, in some ways, changed the way you do things or the way you think about doing things? Or is it sort of business as usual with a new challenge, a new disease?
Yeah, thanks, Rob. That's a great question. It's one that we are discussing quite a bit right now, and I know many of us around the world are, which is which things are going to be permanently changed. About the ways we work. Do I need to be in the office 5 days a week? Well, clearly not, because I haven't been there for 2.5 months. Yet the enterprise continues to move forward. We continue to do science. But also, are there things that we're doing now out of necessity that we should have been doing all along, or that we would have been doing in 2 or 5 or 10 years, but the coronavirus crisis has greatly accelerated our adoption of those new ways of doing things. And there are innumerable, I think, examples of that. Let me just point out a few. In our clinical trials arena, of course, maintaining our clinical trials, the access of patients to those clinical trials, many of whom have grievous illnesses. They can't wait 6 months for the pandemic to pass, or 6 or 12 months, or however long it will take. How do we ensure that they can continue to safely be treated on our clinical trials, enroll in our clinical trials, when they may have challenges getting to a hospital or a clinic where their principal investigator is located, because either that institution is restricting access or there are transportation difficulties. So we've done certain things under flexible FDA guidances that have been put in place to directly ship an investigational product to the patient rather than to the hospital to ensure continuity. Well, that raises questions of why shouldn't we be doing that all the time in some instances? We are engaging with our colleagues in academia, our investigators in a virtual fashion, just the way you and I are talking here. And it's clearly made us pause and reflect that, a number of interactions going forward can be done in this fashion rather than flying everyone in to a city, getting them together. It's inefficient. And, of course, we can't replace face to face interactions, and we'll never want to do that. But there are many things that we can take advantage of virtually that we've learned that we'll simply not go back to doing it the old way in 6 months or 12 months. So, if you're asking me, will things change? I'd say they have changed, and some of those changes are going to stick.
Yeah. So it's very much that new normal that everyone has been talking about. So speaking of the new normal, Quite often, in the press at least, there is a particular emphasis on testing, on contact tracing, and hopefully down the road on the vaccine, to us and all of society returning to some semblance of normalcy. To some degree, I've been surprised that there's not quite as much discussion, maybe because there's too much noise in the environment, around the role that a drug therapy will play in our ability to return to normalcy, right? Because we tend to focus on the vaccine, but I would say, arguably it's the case that more effective therapies that reduce the number of individuals going into ICUs will also have sort of a dramatic impact on that. As someone who thinks very much about therapy and the way therapy fits in the broader spectrum of what needs to be done to conquer or at least make a disease manageable, can you speak to your current thinking about how important therapy will be for our return to normalcy in the face of COVID-19?
I think therapeutics, and there are half a dozen at least broad categories of therapeutics that we can think about will be very important. If nothing else, we will need therapeutics to reduce the morbidity and mortality from the disease as a bridge until such time as one of two things occurs. Either we have a vaccine or we've got herd immunity. And since neither one of those is likely, in the next few months or even 6 months, quite frankly, we need bridging therapies, which again can fit into a variety of categories: direct antivirals, drugs that interrupt the ability of the virus to bind to and infect human cells, drugs that treat the hyperinflammatory response or the so-called cytokine storm that some patients seem to develop, that is a source of developing very serious disease and in some cases fatal disease. There is a clotting syndrome that appears to happen with this particular virus, and many of the folks, many will have read about the, small little clots that seem to form in lungs and potentially other organs or even causing strokes. Are there more effective ways in preventing that outcome in those who are infected with the virus? So I think it's not going to be a magic bullet. It's actually going to be a combination of a lot of these used in conjunction to try to, again, really mitigate the seriousness of the disease and the potential death rate until such time as we have a vaccine.
Yeah, yeah. So, do you feel that, of course, we're already seeing it, and you have a much clearer sense of this, the degree to which we're able to accelerate some of those sort of pipelines of drug development? If you think about, for example, some of the antivirals that were developed to treat HIV, they were on very short cycles of development. Are we seeing a similar thing for COVID-19, for the coronavirus?
You know, Let me actually just broaden out in my initial approach to answering that question. One of the things that I find heartening about the future is the way that this has created new collaborations. I'd say, qualitatively new collaborations. I sit with a group of my peers, the heads of R&D, for example, on a group that, kind of ad hoc came together and said, look, this is an all hands on deck moment. This is the greatest public health crisis in a century since the pandemic of 1918. What do we need to do? That collegiality is not just among my industry colleagues, but the ways that, what I call the sort of tripartite set of bodies, or the three legs of the stool: academia, government, and industry, are coming together to work collaboratively, are essential for the for coping with the epidemic, but it's also a model for the future. Why shouldn't we be doing that in general for serious human disease? And so To me, there is hope and there is optimism. It's tempered with realism that this is a tough virus. It's a tough virus, and we can't sugarcoat that fact. And it's complicated, and there's a lot that we're still learning. But each day we are learning, and we're pooling that learning. We're trying to share information in real time, and we're trying to move forward.
Yeah. Well, so, I mean, I think you have shared some, I think, tremendous insights for us in terms of how a drug company's R&D is responding to and thinking about what's happening with COVID-19. Um, I think our viewers and listeners would also love to get a little bit of an insight further into you, Dave, as a person. So when you're not leading this remarkable R&D effort for Amgen, a world-class drug company, what does David Reese do?
Well, well, my day job keeps me pretty
I
busy, but
suspect so.
I love doing two things. Of course, spending time with my family, my wife, who runs a not-for-profit and is just a tremendous individual. My son's just finished his junior year in college. Of course, the second semester finished online, just like everyone else. And so, we're very tight knit, and we spend a lot of time together. And then my hobby is I can attest to. If you simply look over my shoulders, you will see a lot of books, and
Yeah.
that's part of my library of several thousand volumes that are scattered around the house. But I've been an inveterate reader since I was 4 or 5 years old, and that's what I do to unwind and have interest ranging from classical literature to philosophy to history to contemporary fiction to everything in between, and that's my way of staying engaged with the world.
Oh, fantastic. Because I was about to say that you have a backdrop that looks more like a professor in the humanities than what than what you
Yeah.
might normally see.
Well, that's my yeah, that's in another lifetime I'd be a professor of English literature or professor of history. But, so we'll see. Maybe in an alternate universe, that's what's taken place.
Well, in some ways, you've already answered what was going to be one of my follow-up questions, which is that we all take sort of, we all turn left or turn right at forks in the road, at various steps of our lives, our careers, etc. And so, a question I was going to ask you, which in some ways you have already answered, but I'd love to hear a further sort of elaboration, is if Dave Reese had turned left instead of turning right at a particular point, either in high school or middle school or in college, etc., in that parallel universe, what would that Dave Reese be doing? And what was the fork in the road where you chose right instead of left or left instead of right?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think Dave Reese probably would have become a historian in this alternate universe. That's my probably single biggest passion outside of my day job. And I've absolutely, look, I have the best job on the planet, in a lot of ways, that combines cutting edge science, clinical development, and being part of the leadership team of a large premier company, and all of the business and leadership challenges, personal challenges that brings. But yeah, so professor of history is probably the path I would have taken. uh, I've always been both left brain and right brain, I guess, and this strong attraction to the humanities. But I think like a scientist at heart. When I first wake up in the morning, that's how I'm thinking, and so I think that's what led to me taking that particular bend in the road.
So, what kind of history would you be a professor of in the alternate universe?
Probably American history, something that I read deeply in. Of course, I'm an educated amateur. I'm not a professional historian by any stretch. History of medicine actually is something that interests me. In academia, I published some papers here and there in the history of medicine. Largely self-taught in that discipline, but had the advantage of taking I could take advantage of some libraries that I had access to, for example. And so, there are ways to put all of these things together, and it's still possible to aspire to be a Renaissance person in this day and
Mhm.
age, although the demands of being an expert in your given field go up and up, it seems.
Yeah. I mean, I think one thing that's striking is that as time goes by, the traditional boundaries between the various broad domains or fields seem to be becoming increasingly porous or blurry. Because I've been struck, for example, over the last decade, the conversations I have with colleagues of mine in the history department really show sort of a development in history that's more towards social science as opposed to sort of a more interpretive view of history, where I have colleagues now that are essentially data scientists that are
Right?
using data
Yeah,
what happened
exactly.
historically to really understand it in
Yep.
sort of a big data way, which is quite interesting. So it's intriguing how these two things are perhaps not as distinct as they might have been sort of at one point. Um,
Yeah, Wilson wrote a book some years ago called Consilience about the sort of collapse of disciplines into one another. Certainly in my own world, I see that, and when I talk about to new scientists at Amgen, and they're interested in following a certain path, one of the things I point out is there's no such thing really as a field anymore. You used to be a molecular biologist or an immunologist or a cardiologist, and that was the one, the lane that you swam in. Well, now, you know, if when someone joins our company, they very quickly have to absorb many other disciplines, and the odds are that 5 or 8 years later they're going to be doing something very different, for example, than what they did in their postdoc. It's an almost certainty.
yes,
And I think that's a pattern that's playing out almost everywhere in the world. And so, I would say not only are the boundaries before between fields getting porous, as you said, they're dissolving in many cases. And that to me is really the fun part of the world to come. If I could have a chance to do it again, that's the part that I would really love to take advantage of.
of course. So, so along those same lines, you've made it so clear that the pathway from sort of an idea or sort of an initial observation and having a medicine that can save lives in hand is long and complicated with sort of multiple phases. It's often thought that if a drug company were, stepping into a 4-year college or into a high school and trying to foster and trying to recruit future individuals that might be at that company, the stereotype would be is okay, we'll go after the chemists, we'll go after the biologists, and that's kind of about it. Maybe the
Right.
mathematicians, maybe the computer scientists. But given the complexity and length of the pipeline that you have discussed, if you were to step into a high school or a college right now and talk to students that have a broad range of interests, what other kinds of students would you love to see become interested in and engaged in drug development, for example?
The sky's the limit, really. I have individuals in my organization who are, lawyers by training. They're involved in regulatory affairs or they're involved in the policy aspects of what we do, which is another, entire field unto itself. What I'm really looking for is I want to find those students who have the critical thinking skills and they've married that with the real passion to make a difference, to drive things forward, to produce something that in the end, our goal is to change medicine, to help change the world and again, alleviate human suffering. And those are high flown phrases, but it's something that we really carry with us every day. And we've been invested with enormous amounts of responsibility by society. And part of the social contract is that we have to deliver on our end of that bargain. So, there's a role for almost anyone in our industry who is interested in developing good drugs for bad diseases and everything that goes in there, and then not only developing them but ensuring that they're getting to people, that people around the world have access to those medicines, and that they're being used correctly. Once the drug's on the market, the story's not over. We continue to learn an enormous amount about that drug, and our responsibilities continue for many, many years. So, it's a huge, highly heterogeneous enterprise. And the but there's a spot for almost anyone. And quite frankly, the spot you ultimately end up with is probably going to be very far afield again from the spot you started in.
Of course.
And that's
Yes, yes, that's really beautifully said. So, Dave, one thing I'd also like to ask you is so for LabXchange, one of our taglines is learning without limits. And what I think almost everyone has experienced is that at some point in their lives, it might have been in middle school, high school, earlier or later, there's some kind of hurdle, some kind of limit that sort of stood in the way of either where we wanted to go or where we thought we could or couldn't go. And so, something that I ask if you could share with our viewers and listeners in your sort of long and truly illustrious sort of career, has there been a moment where there was a hurdle or a limit that you had to jump over, push through, break through, that in your opinion was sort of an important step for you in terms of where you are today?
Yeah, let me answer that in what you might find an interesting fashion, which is, to me, the hurdle was internal, not external. I came from this little town. Again, I was the first person in the family to go to college. And, when I got to college, of course, I was going into the sciences and I was taking the usual first, freshman, sequences in chemistry and biology. And, I was surrounded by people who, were coming from prep schools or very high powered high schools, around the country. And so for me, the critical step was gaining the confidence that, I belonged among these folks and that I was just as good as they were and better than some of them. And, not in an arrogant way, but in that way that, makes you comfortable that you can actually compete in this kind of environment. And so that for me kind of came with the first set of midterm exams in the freshman year, where I did reasonably well, and that gave me the confidence to say, okay, now it's up to you. You're not a mistake. You're not in the wrong spot, and now it's up to you to work hard and go forward. And I understood that I was very unsophisticated compared to some of my peers at that point, and that I had a little bit of catching up to do. But that was, in a way, an advantage as well, because I had a lot of room to run. And
Right.
and then it's up to you to take to take the opportunity.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Certainly, I think it's what you're sort of describing is what is often called, having some kind of imposter syndrome, right? Where you feel
Exactly.
like you don't actually belong there. And I think
Right.
increasingly in colleges and universities around the country, really trying to address that, really recognizing that folks are coming from such different backgrounds.
Remarkably diverse.
Yeah, but you need to have a place that really allows them to feel that they belong and that they
Right.
can really succeed, and that there are tools and resources and people that are there to help you succeed. I think it's so different in some ways from the way quite often science was handled, sort of specifically. When I was in college, which was sort of a sink or swim thing. I
Right.
mean, in some ways, those early science courses were designed to weed you out.
Oh, they were a filtering
Yeah,
process.
exactly. If you didn't exactly fit the mold from the beginning, then you didn't belong. And I think, thank goodness we're fast forwarded to a time now where really it's more about giving everyone the opportunity.
Yeah, and I think there's a critical piece to what you just said that I've come to appreciate over time. And anybody who manages, large groups of people realizes this, which is, there may be individuals, for example, who aren't succeeding in their current role, but it's not lack of talent, lack of drive on the part of the individual. It's the wrong role, what we call the wrong fit. And okay, that's partly on them, but it's also on you because you had them in that role and maybe you didn't recognize that that wasn't the right spot for their own development and for the organization. But there may be another role where they're going to thrive. And I've seen that much more often than not. And so when you institute these sorts of filtering processes that are designed to produce, what's in the end a relatively homogeneous, output. What you don't appreciate is what you may be losing uh, in those who are being filtered out in terms of where they can contribute elsewhere. And so, to me, that has been a huge recognition. And there are sometimes people that simply aren't suited to be on a team, but much more often than not it is finding the right spot for them.
Yeah, yeah. So I think, one thought perhaps we can close with, which has been inspired by the many ideas that you've shared with us, is that ultimately dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic and returning us to a new normal will depend on all hands being on deck. You spoke to an increased sense of the importance of being highly collaborative. I mean, you've also spoken to the power of sort of a diverse range of skills and perspectives and drivers, etc. I do think we're at a moment where, for the pharmaceutical industry, if there is ever a moment where pharma is going to save the day, I think this is probably one of them, right?
Well, if not now, when?
Right,
That,
exactly, exactly.
that's
So,
certainly
Dave,
how.
I'm confident that you and all of your colleagues and will be playing a critical role in saving the day. And I can't thank you enough, given how busy I know you must be, for taking the time to talk with us in the exchange. So, Dave, thank you so much for sharing with us.
Well, thank you, Rob, and thank you for the tremendous work on LabXchange. It's really a gift to the world.
Okay, my pleasure.